Campus Context, a limited series from Student Affairs Now, the online learning community for those of us who work in, alongside, and adjacent to higher education and student affairs. I'm your host, Heather Shea, and we are recording this episode at 5:04 p.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, April 3rd. As always, things may have changed by the time you listen. So each week, we are breaking down the shifting landscape of higher education, what's happening, why it matters, and how we can respond. But we've talked a lot about staying informed is just not enough. Recent Inside Higher Ed piece by Nolan Cabrera, which we're going to talk a little bit about today, raised a crucial question. What does it mean to navigate this moment with both awareness and action? And he put it, this is not the battle we chose, but this is the battle that we're in. We're going to unpack that article a little bit today, but with ongoing debates over all of the things that we've been discussing, academic freedom, institutional autonomy, and student access, how should higher ed leaders, faculty, and staff engage? And that's what we're going to be unpacking today with our expert guests. So first, back again this week, Dr. Crystal Garcia. Welcome back, Crystal.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yeah, so Crystal is an expert in minoritized college students' experiences with campus environments. She is an associate professor and PhD program coordinator in the Department of Educational Administration at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And also welcome back, Dr. Felecia Commodore. Hello.
Hi, everyone. Excited to be back. Excited to be here with Crystal for the first time. So great.
I love it. Dr. Commodore is an expert in leadership, governance, and administrative practices in higher ed with a focus on HBCUs, MSIs, and Black women in leadership. She is an associate professor in education policy, organization, and leadership at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So good to have you both here today. So let's dive in. We're going to give a brief news recap. Over the past few weeks, we've tracked the growing pressures on higher education, whether through the dismantling of the Department of Ed, the weaponization of federal funding, or new policies that restrict institutional autonomy. This week, we're going to build on those themes. There are three major highlights that bring the stakes even higher. First, we're seeing more and more international students targeted for detention and deportation. In short, they are being disappeared, largely without due process. And this has me, really, really concerned, but also makes me wonder what happens to the rights of students on visas in these situations? What is the role of universities in protecting them? And what does this mean for global education and international students on our campuses? So that's topic number one. Topic number two, as I mentioned in the intro, Dr. Nolan Cabrera recently wrote a Dear Colleague letter on essentially what good are academic freedom and tenure if faculty aren't going to use them. This letter was published in Inside Higher Ed, and it challenges educators to push back against self-censorship in the face of political pressure. But I guess I find myself asking, how can faculty, even those with tenure, effectively stand up when the risks, both personal and institutional and for their students, could be so high? So third topic. Last week, we talked about professional associations as higher ed's last line of defense. And here's something I think we actually missed, and it was brought to my attention by my colleague, Monique Atherley. Dr. Atherley, thank you for your information. This is about the power of labor unions and their collective action. Faculty, grad workers, and staff unions are rising up against the political and financial attacks on higher ed. From strikes to legislative advocacy, they are making it clear that they won't stand by while institutions are gutted. We're going to link in our resources today several upcoming days of action. But this all makes me wonder, how can we, student affairs educators and faculty, engage in this movement? And what risk do we face if we protest or take action? All right, so let's dig in. Crystal, I know you are an expert on minoritized college students' experiences and what I've just shared about the threats towards international student visa holders. What are the implications you see for those of us who work closely with international students?
Yeah, I think that we might have even started touching on this in my first episode that I was on. And honestly, it has just been increasingly frightening to see what has been unfolding in terms of international students and staff and faculty as well. But to focus in on international students specifically, we I think in our last discussion, which I mean, if we think like, weeks have passed and it feels like so much more time because so much is happening all the time.
Yes.
We talked about Mohammad Khalil.
Mhm.
And, since that time, more details have unfolded around other students. Rajani Srinivasan was a Columbia student who the State Department revoked her student visa. Then Columbia revoked her registration. Was like an almost finished PhD student
Oh,
who fled to Canada out of fear of what was going to happen to her. Because I mean, I can't imagine what is going through students' minds right now as they think about deportation possibilities, and where they might end up. They may be taken to a completely different country that they have no connections with, whatsoever. There's so much uncertainty about that, and so I can understand the students' fear and what led them to make that decision. But this student was interviewed by CNN and was very assertive that she was not active in politics. She, quote, said, "I'm not a terrorist sympathizer. I'm not pro Hamas activist. I'm just literally a random student. It just seems very strange that they would spend so much vast resources in persecuting me." And she's not the only one. So Tufts University
yeah.
had a PhD student, or Mesa Ozturk. I'm so sorry if I am mispronouncing their name, but that they were walking alone, one
Yeah.
night to go meet friends, and horrifically, and I don't know if you've seen the
I've
footage of
seen the
this.
video. It's terrifying.
It's scary. I mean, my heart was
Terrifying.
racing. Yes.
Yeah.
Seeing this group of people surround her in plain clothes, masked, which
Yeah.
we can talk all day about the hypocrisy of demanding that Columbia not allow masks on their campus and then sending agents and that are masked to do this work. Um, and again, Tufts, more recently, I was glad to see this, filed a declaration in support of this student,
Okay.
asserting that this student was in good standing, that they had no, reason to believe that they were a threat to campus or otherwise, which, we know this to be true of these students already. But I was glad to see the university come out in support of the student. And, this just kind of compounds on all the other things that we've seen happening so far. And that question of due process, like, where
Yeah.
is it? These students were led to believe that they were seeking, the top education. The US is like such a place of learning and growth and development. To only be targeted in this way is really terrifying. And just to give another minute to the situation from Tufts, of thinking about, what does this mean for campuses forward? Are students now expected to comply with people that are not dressed in official attire, who aren't even showing their entire faces, who take them into unmarked vehicles? I am so afraid of the harm that this may open up for other people who want to leverage this moment and hurt students,
Yes.
just individuals, because they can. And I wish that more universities were speaking out against it. I did see, though, I think just today, that a story came out from Democracy Now! That was covering a collective of Jewish students that chained themselves to Columbia's gates to protest the detainment of Mohammed Khalil. And one of those
Oh,
students, their name is Carly, was quoted to say, and I thought this was so impactful: "There has not been transparency from the Columbia administration to Jewish students when they claim that they are doing all of this to protect Jewish students. we would like to be consulted in that process instead of being spoken for. As Jewish students and to the Jewish people at large, being political pawns in a game is not a new occurrence. And that's something we are very much so here to say, hey, you cannot weaponize anti-Semitism to harm our friends and peers. Students are speaking out, which I love to see, but yeah, I mean, I don't know what else to say except that I'm just so concerned. I fear that we're seeing this happening in some campuses, and I just reiterate to folks that if it's happening on any campus, it matters to you because you're the next campus, your students, your community members. And so if we're not pushing back now and advocating against this and calling it out for the horror that it is, then I'm just fearful of what that might lead to next.
It feels like we're then complicit. I think what I want to encourage folks to do, we'll link some of these articles, is to review. And I think the quotes and the names are really important here, right? And I also want to say, what is due process, right? So like, what is that? And why is it being denied student visa holders? And if it's being denied them, who is next, right? Due process may be denied to anyone. And then I get really super anxious and nervous about like our larger student body as well. Felecia, what would you add? Or do you want to dig into one of the other topics?
Well, I'll just add something real quick because it's just the way things that I've been thinking about. I think one, I think you bring up a really good question, right? What is due process, and what does it mean on our campuses? And two things that come to mind with that for me is one, this is one of the challenges of the whirlwind of things that the administrators have had to deal with, because in these cases, you would usually bring in your general counsel, right? But our general counsels are all dealing with bringing cases against the federal government for funding and all of these things. And so everyone's head is moving in 50 million directions at the same time, which I would, say is probably by design, so that they can't pull on the same resources we would usually pull on, because these instances would be so one-off. And in this case, they're part of a bunch of chaos. I think the second thing is, we mentioned Columbia, we mentioned the incident at Tufts, and I think it's important to note that these are private institutions, right? And so when we think about due process is often connected to constitutional kind of protection. And what we know is that there are some variances in how we navigate constitutional rights on private campuses versus public campuses. So doesn't catch me too off guard that we're seeing these instances specifically starting with, because they're going to come to public campuses soon, but we're seeing them more start on these private university campuses, because it's not public, it's not state governed, sanctioned land, right? And so I think these are little nuances that I think are important to consider. And then lastly, I'll say this. I was someone who started college in the fall of 2001, actually a couple weeks after 9/11. And I remember there was so much fear from our students particularly from Middle Eastern countries, that they did not come to school. And I can remember half of, residence hall floors just not being there, right? And so aside from the humanity part of it, which is super important, like seeing a student just taken off of the street was, like I said, terrifying to me. But also, institutions really have to think about what happens when their international students don't feel safe anymore on our campuses. They're not going to come to school. They're not going to enroll in our schools. And honestly, we can't afford that. Many of our institutions survive off of international student tuition, right? And so all of these things have trickle down effects for our institutions and why it's imperative for us to be pushing back against what's happening. Aside from the fact, as and Crystal so eloquently stated, it may be international students today, it'll be our domestic
Yeah.
students tomorrow.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it is absolutely scary. And I appreciate that conversation too about the funding piece, because I think we've been talking about funding quite a bit. But I mean, I keep asking the question, why is all of this happening? It is all related to money, right? And I think that money equals power, and institutions have resources. One of their resources are an incredibly broad group of amazing faculty who are experts, content area experts on their area of expertise, right? So like when I think about Dr. Cabrera's piece, what does academic freedom get you for speaking out? And so I'd love Felecia for you to we had a little chat in the notes
Yeah.
for today's episode. Yeah.
Yeah. So I read the piece, and I think there were parts of the piece that very much resonated with me, especially as someone who's very passionate about shared governance and about academic freedom on our campuses. And you can ask anyone I've ever worked with that I always say, there's nothing more I hate more than when full professors don't act like full professors,
Yeah.
right? We fight so hard for tenure. We work so hard to have the ability to walk fully in our academic freedom. And then a lot of times we just don't show up. Right. And there's various reasons for that. So there was a part of me that was like, yes, but I think another part of me was like, this time, I mean, this is not new, but it is slightly different.
Yeah.
And I think and the piece did acknowledge there are some contextual um, considerations and nuances, but I think, we really have to think about all of the layers of what has happened, not just right now, but over the last 5 or 6 years that have weakened people's belief in academic freedom. We believe it's a concept. We say it's a value of our institutions, but I think you would talk to people before this year on a number of campuses that would say, I don't really have academic freedom. Like they tell me I have it, but I don't really have it. And so there was already a mistrust
Yeah.
in being safe and protected through academic freedom that was already occurring, that I think it's a little difficult now to think people are going to totally place that distrust on the shelf and believe that their institutions will protect them.
Yeah.
Right. And I think we need to be real about that and then the other thing I would say about that is I think also we have to be real about two things. One, um, Dr. Cabrera talks about self-censorship.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I thought about that and I was like, I don't know that everyone's self-censoring. I think that some people are self-preserving.
Yeah.
And I think some people agree with what's going on. And I think we need to be honest about that we have faculty and people within our universities who are maybe silently cheering what's happening right now. And so being realistic about that, but also there are some people who are like, why would I stand up now when I've stood up before and there was no community there for me.
Yeah.
There was no one to champion my cause, to help protect my academic freedom. And so I think some people are also like, I'm opting out, or I am going to work diligently to protect my students. I'm going to work diligently to protect my communities. And that's where I'm going to put my work in, as opposed to being a loud voice on a speakerphone right now. And so I think there's all these different things going on. And then we can get into things like doxing and the threat of violence on people, on faculty. I mean, I've had colleagues I've seen get crazy emails after being on a podcast or publishing something. And, that's a real we're seeing people get taken off the street, right? We're seeing people attack people at their homes, and I think that's real. So for me, I do agree. We need to stand up and fight for what we believe is core value in higher education. But I also think even more important than that is we have to rebuild a belief in a faculty community so that if someone, one, wants to speak up, they feel that there's a safety in numbers and
Yep.
protection. But two, that everyone has a role to play, even if they aren't the person to speak up, that they
Mhm.
can access an element or a point, a piece in the movement that they can all work together, because speaking up alone won't do it, because like I said, we have staff to protect, we have students to protect, we have families to protect, right? And so everyone's going to play their own part, and it may not be vocal. So really, I think leaning back into seeing our universities as communities as opposed to just a
Absolutely.
conglomerate of people.
Yeah. I think that's a really important point. And I've been thinking a lot about this idea of organizing and collective action because it's lonely to be out there alone. And it's lonely to feel like your efforts, like what am I really contributing? But then you start thinking about the coalitions that are being built. Um, and so finally, the third topic about labor unions. And I don't know if either of you have experience working with labor unions. I was in a union prior to moving to my current role, and was very glad to have that support at a couple of different times during my time as a staff member here at Michigan State. So I think labor unions have some different types of power and maybe are stepping up in the legal field in ways that we haven't seen them do in a while. Yeah, either of you want to
So,
talk about
so I just moved from a anti, well, I shouldn't say anti, a state that did not have unions
an unfriendly
to
state? Yeah.
to a state that now has unions for faculty and staff and facility workers, all those things. And so this has been a learning curve for me, actually, and things that I don't think I ever thought about before.
Yeah.
And I do think there is, having made that transition, that back to what I was saying before, there does feel a bit of protection in
Mhm.
that,
Mhm.
in being able to say, go to your union rep and say, hey, this is not what's supposed to be happening, or I feel like there are things that are going against what our agreements were. And not necessarily having to be you, but that then gets to be a
Mhm.
representative. So I think there is some value in that, but it is challenging because in higher ed, it really can
Yeah.
depend on what state you are in, how your institution is organized. All of that stuff matters, and so it's not a consistent practice or value across the country, particularly if you're in right to work states. What I found, I don't know if anybody knows this, but there is a national collective bargaining and higher education conference that happens every year at Hunter College in New York. So I've had a chance to go a couple of times. And so what we found is that where they are trying to unionize at colleges, and it's hard in right to work states because people are like, well, what do I need a union for? We have the right to work laws. And so where I see the benefit, I think it's also hard to think about that at a national level when it's so inconsistent across the country.
Yeah. Crystal, what about you? Experience with
Yeah.
unions or thoughts on that?
Yeah, really no experience with them. Within our system, some of our institutions are unionized, and then like ours is not, our campus is not. But I do definitely know that there's value in collective representation and action. And so, even as I think, like, kind of connecting back to Dr. Commodore's comments on Dr. Cabrera's piece, I understand, the rationale, and I hear it, and I feel myself being drawn to it sometimes, right? Of like, come on, y'all, we got to do something, like, let's
Yeah.
go. But then I mean, I do understand the realities of that are very different for people, and definitely different based on who they are, how they show
Yeah.
up in the world, what their positions of power are, what their risk is, etc. And so, I think back to, yes, unions, but then also even just like collectives. So like, I was at Auburn University previously and then now at UNL. And in both institutions, we had these groups, these collectives that were basically folks that were doing critical work, that were, scholars that cared about social justice and, equity and being good and doing good in the world. And so, for me at UNL, even though we don't have a union, that organization, that group, that collective, which I serve as a co-lead for with Dr. Stephanie Bondi, who's also amazing.
Love her.
We do so much together through our organization, and it feels less vulnerable because it doesn't feel like, oh, it's just Crystal and it's just Stephanie. No, it's our collective that's coming together, and that has power in and of itself. And so I do encourage folks that if you don't have something like that, that start rounding people up. Just start saying, hey, you do this work, I do this work. Like, let's make a group. What's our name going to be? There's just so much opportunity to work together and to feel less alone in it.
That's
and I would add, Heather, because it wouldn't be me if I didn't bring a little history moment into these conversations. But I think when we look back, because what I liken this time period to the most in our history of higher education in the US is McCarthyism, right?
Yep.
And so when we look back at that time and we see the stories that are the recounting of what happened during that time in academia, what Crystal mentioned is exactly what we saw, right? Was these informal networks of academics and scholars and intellectuals at campuses and in communities that were supporting each other, that were making sure, like, if they knew where institutions where they would be welcomed or would be able to practice. I mean, we even saw historically when we were kind of at a height of anti-Semitism, Jewish faculty were not getting hired by campuses. It was HBCUs that were saying, hey, you can come here and teach. So I think these informal networks are going to be super, super important now for spaces and places where there aren't unions, or there is an aversion to unionization, right? I think the other thing we want to be keen on, and I saw some stories around this, is that, and it's again very similar to what we saw during McCarthyism, is that there's some rumblings about European universities seeing this as a prime opportunity to recruit U.S. faculty, and saying like, hey, we'll get you your we'll get you your funding, we'll get you your and so I think that is something we need to keep an eye on. And for folks who may feel that they're in places where their livelihood is at stake, a lot of these European universities are like, this might be the time to start sending out some feelers and recruitment efforts. And I think that is something we really need to pay attention to.
Yeah, it is not subtle. My partner is a faculty member at the University of Michigan, and he shared this post, and it was like, do you investigate DEI? You can come here and we will fund it, right? It's like so direct. I think that was at Marseille University and is in France, south of France. I was like, living in the south of France.
Well, that sounds kind of inviting. Not that I want you to go anywhere, Heather. It's enticing.
I do lead an undergrad study abroad, and I'll be leaving in May to go to the Netherlands. And the Dutch people, I think, are so welcoming. I think my children would be upset if I didn't come back. But anyway, besides leaving the country, let's talk about actions, because I am really curious about this idea of supporting international students in face of the threats. What are some of the actions that we might be able to take within our spheres of influence? Dr. Commodore, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So, I think about things kind of macro and micro. I think at the macro level, we really need to push our institutions to not just put out statements, but to actually, for lack of better words, codify how they're going to protect their students. We need processes, we need policies,
Yep.
and we need affirmation from board of trustees. We need institutions to not just say they're going to do it, but show us how they're going to do it. And then I think on the micro level, and I think about myself particularly as a faculty member, I think we need to be in regular communication with our international students,
Mhm.
and we need to have processes ourselves. I know I've thought about this. What happens if an ICE agent shows up at my classroom? What am I going to do, right?
Yeah.
And I've been lucky. My university has processes for us, and they've given us instructions on how to navigate that process and stay within the legalities that we have to abide in. But and I think we need to, again, I'm going to say it, I say it over and over again, we
Mhm.
have to think about what we do in terms and through a lens of community. And so these are not just our students or our colleagues, right? These are people that we are in community with. So
Mhm.
how are we going to work and move and act and strategize as a community to not just protect
Mhm.
folks, but to
Mhm.
also give them a feeling of security and safety, because I think a number of our students are on edge, and that affects their mental health, their
Yeah.
emotional health, their ability to engage in work and in our classrooms. And so I just think we have to be very intentional. But part of that is talking with our students, finding out what they're thinking, finding what they're feeling, what's happening with them and their families, and then strategizing and thinking about ways that we can support them.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Garcia, what would you like to add?
Yeah, I 100% all of that. And I would also add, whenever we think about these interactions with,
Mhm.
ICE or Homeland Security, whatever the case might be, I have so far been thinking in terms of classroom interactions of what would I do? How would I respond? How can I be
Mhm.
prepared? And I think that is really important. We need to know that. But additionally, now I think it's our institutions are being called on to give direction and guidance and training, perhaps, of what do students do in the case that they're encountered outside of class, with people that are in an unmarked vehicle, with people that are wearing plain clothes. What do people that are seeing this happen do? What's their responsibility? How can they document things in a way that is safe for them, that also captures the moment? um it's so gross. I don't even, I don't know where we're at right now in having to talk about this. Like, I never in my life thought that we would be accepting that sort of quote unquote, official interaction. And it's horrifying. So in any case, providing more guidance and context around that. And then I would also just like reiterate the need for folks to link up. um
Yeah.
we are vulnerable. Like, just
Mhm.
even Googling the work that we do, like, you don't
Yep.
even have to do anything extra. In some of these cases where people are being targeted, it's for something that they wrote, a year ago. It's not even something that they're doing in this moment. And so we need to support each other. We need to
Yeah.
have action plans in place. What will happen if my colleague gets detained? What will happen if my colleague gets fired immediately without cause? What plans do we have in place to support each other, legally
Yeah.
speaking, and then also otherwise? Like, I've seen folks do social media campaigns around folks that aren't getting tenure because they were participating, right, in supporting Palestine and rallies, etc. And
Wow.
the campaigns around it seem on the ready, right? But I'm sure that folks had to kind of scramble to put those things together. How can we be proactive of having supports, things ready to go when the moment calls for it, so that we don't feel overwhelmed or confused about what we should do to support our colleagues? So I'm just like, plan for the worst case scenario, unfortunately, in these cases,
Yeah.
and let's have a plan in place and share it with others. Like, there's no
Yeah.
reason why like Felicia's campus couldn't be using the same like resources and toolkits that I have in my campus. And how can we work together to do things like that?
Yeah, it's like we need a whole new playbook, and crisis management, and risk management, but from this lens of, it's not the ambiguous if this happens. I think for most campuses, it's when this happens. So, well, we could keep talking about all of the concerns, and I really appreciate you both and your time. So I want to end us with the 3 questions that I think I'm enjoying, at least, because I keep thinking about what is bringing me joy. So 3 questions: what's on the horizon? What's keeping you up at night? Those might be the same things. And then what's bringing you joy? Dr. Garcia, do you want to go first?
Sure. On the horizon, I'm thinking about this toolkit situation, right?
Yes.
Like, what are the things that I've already been developing? Like, for example, me and my colleagues have sent a letter, outlining all the different ways that higher ed is under attack to our faculty senate. We've put forth resolutions or encourage folks to put forth resolutions, and those things have been introduced to our faculty senate. We have, spoken out at our Board of Regents meeting against implementing changes in response to the Dear Colleague letter. We've testified at the state legislature against anti-DEI things. And I'm like, we're recreating these things over and over, and everybody's doing it all in different pockets. And so how can we put our resources together and say, here's some templates, here's some guides, here's some things that we've used. You can modify it, you can edit it, you can, use it in your own context. So on the horizon, I think, like, I'm excited about that of how can I continue to, help other people, and maybe they can help me too, because I need help. I need help. We all need it, I feel like, right now. And what is keeping you up at night? Oh my gosh, like, what's not? I think I said that exact same thing last time. But I think I'm starting to, this is sad, maybe, because I think that at the beginning of this administration, it was a lot of shock. I mean, I'm a very, I internalize a lot of things. I'm a very emotional person in the sense that I care. I have empathy for other people, and like it affects me. And so I felt emotionally heavy every single day, all of the days. And I feel, sadly, in a way, like I'm becoming more and more numb to some of the horrors that are happening. And it's becoming more normal for me, which I don't like, if I'm being honest with you. And so it's like I'm sleeping better in some ways, but in some ways I'm not, because I'm disturbed that we're becoming used to atrocities. And I don't like that. What's bringing me joy? I need all the joy. My family, my dogs. I just sat in on a session a couple nights ago that we did, like, community building. I think I mentioned this before. I'm part of like a group of folks in our state that, want change. And we did an educational session, and someone led that session around gardening and, starting your seeds, and how you can plant. And I am so new to all of that, but I really want to amp it up. I'm the type of person that whenever I find a hobby, I like really go all in. I'm like, I need all of the things. Get me the tiller, get me like everything. And I'm like, day one, I've never, really done that. So that I'm looking forward to. Gardening, because spring is here, to Dr. Commodore's beautiful, metaphor of like the changing seasons and what we can look forward to. So yeah. And thank you for sharing that beautiful, beautiful analogy to think about in thinking and comparing to the moment that we're in. But yeah.
Dr. Commodore, what about for you?
Yeah, so I think on the horizon, I'm just leaning more into my work around, particularly working with HBCU governance and boards, and thinking about how we can fortify our boards in this moment, but and also working with some colleagues around thinking about that broadly, not just in the HBCU sector, but across sectors, and really thinking about what are the role of boards in this moment? Also, aside from boards, or I guess in addition to boards, really fortifying our governance structures so that we can protect academic freedom, and really having conversations with my colleagues who are at different touch points across higher education, and thinking about how we can all think about holistically, whether you're student affairs, whether you are, C-suite administration,
Yeah.
whether you are facilities, whether you're athletics, how are we all going to be working together, or how we can all better understand how our universities work, like actually work, not what we think they do, and how they thinking about how they work all together so that we can all be prepared for how things roll out when things are going to happen. Because I think what I'm seeing is people being caught off guard by some of the things we're seeing, because they didn't know how the university worked. And so really making sure that those of us who are working in higher education understand what our institutions actually do and how they operate. So what's keeping me up at night? Uh, I think I said this last week. State legislatures. They, a lot of our states are in legislative session, and there's all kinds of things happening. And then I saw a story today, and I need to investigate it a bit more. But there seems to be some order that went out now about, in order for states to get federal money, they have to prove that they got DEI removed from all their institutions. So that's both K through 12 and higher ed. And so at least the state level activity is really something I'm been kind of trying to keep an eye on, because again, particularly for higher education, that's where we get most of our appropriations from. And that's where a lot of things can be codified in ways that really impact us, that the executive orders don't so much impact us. So really, that's what's keeping me up at night. And then as far as what's bringing me joy, March Madness is bringing me joy, particularly the women's tournament. So I had a perfect Final Four. I'm very excited about that. I even had a perfect region. That's never happened in the history of me doing brackets. And so I am hoping and wishing for a South Carolina UConn rematch for the final. But it's been a really good month of basketball, particularly women's basketball. And so I'm finding a lot of joy in that right now.
I love March for that reason. And it, as we talk about seasons, it's usually the dreariest and wettest month here in Michigan, but March is so exciting. Oh my gosh, so great. Thank you all so much. I've been thinking a lot about how I've been conceiving of this little project, and it would not be possible without the labor of you two and the other three correspondents who are contributing. So I just want to deeply appreciate that, and I look forward to the conversation every week. And I think, Felecia, you're back next week.
I don't know what this means. Does this mean I'm not busy enough?
You had free time on Thursdays. That's what it was.
I do. That's really what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. I love it. Yeah. And I think that, when we talk about labor, like, this is labor, right? This is labor, and it is a service. So if you are watching today and you haven't yet explored the other 4 episodes, we'll link those as well. And you can catch up on all of those at studentaffairsnow.com/current-campus-context. And we also now have a YouTube playlist. So you can just literally hit play and YouTube all of the episodes at once. Just want to appreciate the rest of my Student Affairs Now family, especially Dr. Keith Edwards. Super helpful, keeping me grounded. Also worrying about, like, you're being awfully tuned in to all of this stuff. Are you doing okay? And I'm like, actually, I feel, yes, I'm very informed. And I'm using that for good. There's an outlet, right? So higher ed, as we know, is shifting fast. So keep these conversations going, share this episode, post your takeaways, tag us, send us an email, host@studentaffairsnow.com. So thanks again for tuning in today, brought to you by Student Affairs Now. This has been Current Campus Context. We will see you next week.